Welcome to Brush Up.
Brush Up, your refresher on iconic historical events, fun facts, and much more. Stay tuned.
I'm Roberto.
I'm Judy.
I'm from Quito, Ecuador.
And I'm an American from France.
We are both history enthusiasts.
And today we've whipped up some of our favorite facts about the American Civil War.
Here is your Brush Up.
First, we'll talk about the prelude to the Civil War.
Then, we will talk about the beginning of the conflict.
And finally, the switch in focus and the end of the war.
Let's start by laying out the growing tensions between the North and the South. During the 19th century, the United States was undergoing a huge westward expansion.
In 1803, the United States purchased a large territory from France that basically doubled the size of the country at the time. This is known as the Louisiana Purchase.
In 1819, Florida was ceded by Spain to Americans, and then it was admitted as a state in 1845.
In 1845, Texas was also annexed by the U.S. and became a state after having become independent from Mexico 2 years earlier.
The next year, the British ceded northwestern corner of modern-day America to the U.S.
And finally, the Mexican-American War pitted the two countries against each other between April 1846 and February 1848. Eventually, Mexico ceded a huge western territory to the U.S., basically the entire southwest of modern-day U.S. In general, the incorporation of all this new territory brought up new questions for the United States. For example, there was a lot of debate about slavery and whether it should be legal in the newly acquired territories.
This came to light especially clearly during the Missouri Compromise in 1820. The U.S. was in the process of admitting Missouri as a new state.
In an effort to preserve a balance between free states and slave states, Congress decided that Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, but at the same time, Maine would be admitted as a free state.
Additionally, slavery would be prohibited in the Louisiana Territory above a certain latitude.
However, a couple decades later, in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened all new territories to slavery, essentially reversing the Missouri Compromise.
This is an important event because the Republican Party was born. Its main objective was to push back against this act, based on the principle of opposing slavery's extension into the Western territories.
The Republican platform also spoke of the need to protect free labor and offered a vision for economic development that would be assisted by the federal government.
Additionally, there were also conflicts in the legal system. In 1857, the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, in which a slave was suing another man, made it to the Supreme Court.
The court ruled that it was unconstitutional for a black man to pursue a lawsuit, and the Missouri Compromise was essentially declared unconstitutional because the court ruled that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery.
Although the debate over slavery was an important part of the Civil War, other tensions had been prevalent.
So there was a boiling sentiment that the South wanted to become independent. The North had a lot of manufacturing, had a very good transportation system, and a growing banking industry.
While on the other hand, the South's main revenue was farming and plantations, which relied heavily on slaves to grow crops like cotton and tobacco.
Although the North was much more populated than the South, around 22 million people versus 9 million, the South was actually much richer than the North.
A fun fact is that the Civil War was much more complex than just the abolition of slavery. During the war, President Lincoln wrote in August 1862, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I will do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I will do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I will also do it."
So his objective was really to unify the Union. And tensions actually culminated when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1960. He was a lawyer and statesman from Kentucky, and he was the first Republican to be elected.
Within the first 3 months of his presidency, 7 southern states seceded from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. These states were South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas.
They ended up being led by their own president, Jefferson Davis, who was a hero from the Mexican-American War and a previous senator from Mississippi.
After this split, the first attack broke out. Rebel Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina.
There were 2 full days of fighting, and eventually, Major Robert Anderson from the Union surrendered and the Confederates took over.
It's important to emphasize that the American Civil War was deadlier for Americans than American Revolution, the World War I, the World War II, and the Vietnamese War combined. However, in this first battle, there were no casualties.
After this first battle at Fort Sumter, 4 more southern states joined the Confederacy: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. There were some other border slave states like Missouri, Kentucky, or Maryland who didn't secede, but that had a lot of Confederacy support.
Richmond will become the capital of the Confederacy.
A fun fact is that much of Western Virginia didn't agree with the secession of Virginia, and in 1863, West Virginia was actually incorporated into the Union as the 35th U.S. state.
Before digging deeper into all the battles that happened throughout the Civil War, let's talk more about the tactics that both sides used throughout the battles.
So, the North was very intent on preserving Christianity and played a large defensive role trying to contain the Confederates.
The North had the advantage of numbers, but the South had a good military, and they had a very long coastline.
So the North put together the Anaconda Plan. This plan called for a blockade of the South's coastline to ensure the strangulation of the South by federal land and naval forces.
Generally speaking, the war was fought on 2 main fronts. The Eastern Theater included anything east of the Appalachian Mountains. The Union fought with the Army of the Potomac, while the Confederates fought with the Army of Northern Virginia.
Then there was the Western Theater, which includes battles between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. And there, the Union and the Confederates fought with their own Army of Tennessee. And the Union also had the Army of the Cumberland. So now, the conflict has truly begun.
It is July 21, 1861, and the first Battle of Bull Run is on its way.
At the time, Union General Winfield Scott was the leader of the Federal Army. They were bringing together the Army of the Potomac at the time, and they were instructed to push back the Confederates from moving north from Virginia in Manassas.
In the end, around 35,000 Confederate soldiers forced a great number of Union forces to retreat towards D.C. The Confederate Army leader, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, gained his nickname Stonewall during this battle because he was described to stand as strong as a stone wall.
And this battle was also called First Manassas. Typically at the time, battles had 2 names. There's one for the North, which was based on some sort of landmark near the battle, and the South named their battles based on the names of nearby cities.
In this case, the first Battle of Bull Run will be the northern way of calling the battle, and the Battle of Manassas will be the southern way of calling the battle.
There were various small battles that happened, but basically about a year later, in April 1862, on the Western Front, General Ulysses S. Grant was in charge of the Army of the Tennessee for the Union forces, and he led them through a couple of victories, notably the Battle of Shiloh.
In the eastern side, the 7-day battle happened between June 25th and July 1st, 1862. Robert E. Lee was the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia from the Confederates. He and Stonewall successfully forced the Army of the Potomac to retreat back to D.C.
At the time, McClellan had replaced General Scott as the general-in-chief of the armies. After this loss, McClellan asked Lincoln for more reinforcement, but the latter refused, and McClellan was actually replaced by Halleck as the general-in-chief of the armies. McClellan just remained in charge of the Army of the Potomac moving forward. So the Union was definitely struggling with military leadership, at least on the Eastern Theater.
Funny enough, Robert E. Lee was a great officer in the U.S. Army, so Lincoln actually offered him the command of the federal forces in 1861, but he refused. Shortly after, Virginia seceded from the U.S., so he gave his resignation and accepted to be a general in the Confederate Army.
So later that same summer in 1862, the Second Battle of Bull Run took place.
The Union troops, led by John Pope, struck Stonewall Jackson's forces. Then Lee hit back on the Union forces and drove Pope's army back towards Washington.
This was a much larger battle than the first Battle of Bull Run, and at this point, the Union was losing quite a few battles, or at least not able to make any advances whatsoever.
Shortly after, in September 1862, the Battle of Antietam happened.
So after the second Bull Run victory, Lee began an invasion of the North. However, in September, McClellan struck Lee in Maryland, making the Confederate forces retreat along Antietam Creek into a defensive position, and then they struck them again a couple days later with the Army of the Potomac.
However, there were no definitive winner or territory gained during this battle. In fact, this battle constituted the war's bloodiest single day of fighting.
At this point, Lincoln was still not satisfied with McClellan's performance, so he actually removed him from the command of the Army of the Potomac, and he was replaced by General Burnside. But Burnside himself didn't stay long, and he himself was replaced by Joseph Hooker. So still a lot of uncertainty in the Union military command of the East.
Between the end of 1862 and the beginning of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation took place. This was a proclamation made by Lincoln that freed all the enslaved people in rebellious areas of the country. This was a wartime measure that hurt the Confederates, who lost some of their workforces. About 186,000 black Civil War soldiers joined the Union Army.
The Emancipation Proclamation was a real turning point in the war. There was a clear shift in focus to freeing slaves. However, there is debate about how much this proclamation actually had an effect because it freed slaves in rebellious states, and Lincoln technically had no control over that territory at the time. So a quick aside on the British government. The British at the time recognized the Confederacy as kind of a rebellious entity, but never as a country. They basically stayed neutral during the whole war.
However, certain private English businesses were funding the South because Britain was dependent on the cotton supply from the South. However, once Lincoln made the proclamation, Great Britain was on a pickle. They had abolished slavery in 1833, so once Lincoln made it official, he ensured that Great Britain would not be involved in the war because it became a fight against slavery. Let's finish this episode talking about what happened after the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the war.
In spring 1863, the famous Battle of Gettysburg took place. So a little bit before that, Hooker, who was leading the Army of the Potomac, was planning an attack on the Confederates. But before he could, Lee conducted a surprise attack on the Union forces in the Battle of Chancellorsville.
Shortly after, in June, Lee conducted another attack near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, as he was trying to get to D.C. Confederates were unable to win and lost over 50% of their troops.
Despite this loss, the Union was unable to stop the remainder of Lee's troops from escaping back to Virginia.
Till the date, this remained as the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, with over 50,000 casualties.
Now turning towards the Western Front, General Ulysses S. Grant was making a lot of progress by leading the Vicksburg campaign. He finally managed to take over the town of Vicksburg in Mississippi in what's known as the Siege of Vicksburg.
The siege cut the city off from their supplies to the west. The Confederacy was essentially divided into two. Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas became isolated from the rest.
After this major victory, General Grant led them into the Battle of Chattanooga. This was a huge victory for the Union in Tennessee and opened up a door for them into the South.
About the same time, Lincoln made the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln said that the Civil War was a reaffirmation of the American Revolution, and I quote, that this dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
He really focused on unity, and he expressed how all men are equal.
Early next year, the presidential elections pitted Lincoln against McClellan.
This was the same McClellan who had been a general in the Union and had been let go by Lincoln.
At the end, Lincoln won the re-election and he proclaimed himself as the President of the United States one more time.
Because of his success, in March 1864, Grant was appointed by Lincoln as commander of all Union armies, replacing Halleck. Grant left General Sherman in control of the West, and he went to fight Lee's troops in Virginia.
Finally, Grant surprised Lee and captured Petersburg in the Siege of Petersburg that started in June 1864 and lasted until March 1865.
Helped by the Battle of Chattanooga, which had opened the door to the South, Sherman, who was responsible of the Western Theater, led his army through Georgia and eventually took Atlanta. Then he began the march to the sea.
By mid-February, Columbia and Charleston, South Carolina were under Sherman's command. By mid-April, Sherman got North Carolina under control.
For a full week, Grant pursued the Confederates until they had no more possibilities to escape. Finally, Grant accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox Court on April 9th, 1865, in Virginia.
Sadly enough, Lincoln would not live to see what he had accomplished. On April 14, John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate, assassinated Lincoln at the Fourth Theater in Washington, D.C.
Lincoln may have died, but his legacy didn't. The 13th Amendment that was passed by Congress in January 31st, 1865, was finally ratified in December of 1865. The text reads, Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
It is worth noting that a lot of reforms happened throughout the war and after it. For example, Lincoln was the one responsible to start the Department of Agriculture.
In addition, Lincoln passed the Homestead Act in 1862. There was a lot of debt, so he established the first progressive income tax.
This act also offered free public land to Western settlers and land grants that supported construction of a transcontinental railroad. Greenbacks were also born during this time. A greenback was a slang term for US dollars. They were called greenbacks because their backs were printed in green.
After the war, Andrew Johnson became president, and then he was followed by Ulysses S. Grant, who was actually the 18th president of the United States. There was a long period of Reconstruction between 1865 and 1877, but it still took years for the U.S. to recover fully economically and for Black citizens to actually be recognized as equal.
So, to wrap up our brush up, first, the US had expanded its territory immensely during the first part of the 19th century and had new issues to tackle. There were a number of tensions between the North and the South. Lincoln was elected. The Confederates took over an important federal fort, setting up the Civil War conflict, and 11 southern states seceded from the US, forming the Confederate States of America.
Then, a series of battles took place, most notably in the Eastern and Western theaters. The South had great military leaders like Robert E. Lee and initially held its ground, while the Union had inconsistent leadership, but wore down the South slowly. In 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in rebellious states and changing the focus of the war on this fight to abolish slavery.
Finally, the Union had important victories through the Battle of Gettysburg in the East and General Grant's advances in the West. Lee finally surrendered in April 1865. Lincoln was assassinated, but the 13th Amendment was ratified, freeing slaves and granting them citizenship. It would take years to reconstruct the US and for Black people to be truly treated equally under law.
That's all we've got for today.
We hope you enjoyed this history brush up.
We started this podcast to make history more fun and accessible. If you enjoy the show, please consider subscribing and giving us a positive rating.
We will catch you in the next episode.
In the meantime, share your new knowledge with some friends, or even better, share this podcast with them.
We love the support.